All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into some seriously choppy political waters.
Sounds intense.
It is. We're talking about what a second term for Donald Trump as U.S. president might actually look like.
Now that's a question with a lot of potential answers, isn't it?
It really is. And to try and get a grip on this, we're taking a deep dive into an Al Jazeera article called A Revenge Administration, What 4 More Years of Trump Could Mean.
Oh, yeah, I saw that one making the rounds. The title alone is pretty attention-grabbing.
Right, Revenge Administration. It definitely sets a certain tone, doesn't it? And the article doesn't shy away from some pretty bold claims. The authors warn about a possible shift towards authoritarianism in the U.S.
Authoritarianism, wow, that's a heavy word. They're not pulling any punches.
Nope, not at all. And they base these warnings on both Trump's actions during his first term and some of the, shall we say, intense promises he made during his campaign.
Yeah, some of those campaign pledges definitely raised a few eyebrows. Do you remember the one about using the military against so-called enemies within?
Oh yeah, that one definitely stuck with me. And then there was the talk about prosecuting political rivals and mass deportations.
Strong stuff. It all sounds pretty drastic, but how much of this is actual policy versus, just campaign trail hype? How do we separate the signal from the noise?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, politicians say a lot of things on the campaign trail.
They do. So to figure out what to take seriously, I think it's helpful to look back at what Trump actually did during his first term between 2017 and 2021. What did he actually manage to accomplish?
Makes sense. The Al Jazeera article reminds us about some of the policies he did manage to get through, even with a lot of opposition, like withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accord.
Oh, yeah, that was a big one. Definitely made waves internationally.
And then there was the travel ban that critics called the Muslim ban.
Right, and don't forget those import tariffs. Those really shook things up in terms of global trade.
They did, yeah. So those are examples of Trump actually following through on some of his more controversial promises. But the article also points out that he didn't always get his way.
True. For example, whatever happened to that big, beautiful wall he was going to build on the southern border?
Oh, right. The one Mexico was going to pay for. Last I checked, it's still unfinished.
Yep. And Mexico definitely didn't foot the bill.
Speaking of campaign promises, there's that PolitiFact analysis that showed Trump broke more than half of the promises he made back in 2016.
Uh-oh. Not a great track record.
So does this mean we should be skeptical of his most recent campaign pledges? Or are there reasons to think he might be more likely to follow through this time around?
It's a good question. One key difference this time around is that the Republican Party itself has really rallied around Trump. It's become much more tightly aligned with him than it was back in 2016.
What do you mean by tightly aligned? Like, everyone's on the same page now?
Pretty much. Political scientists would call it a personalist party now.
Personalist party, huh? Not sure I'm familiar with that term. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Basically, it means the party is less about a set of shared ideologies or policies and more about loyalty to a single charismatic leader. In this case, that leader is Trump.
So it's less about what the party stands for and more about who they stand behind.
Exactly. Loyalty to Trump trumps everything else.
So fewer checks and balances within the party itself. Fewer people willing to push back against his agenda.
That seems to be the trend, yeah. Which is why this whole Project 2025 thing has people so worried.
Project 2025. Now, that's a name I haven't heard in a while. It was floating around online a while back, right?
Right. It's a pretty detailed policy document put together by some conservative figures who are closely linked to Trump.
And what's in this document that's causing so much concern?
Well, it basically lays out a roadmap for how to radically reshape the U.S. government. We're talking about things like abolishing entire federal departments, significantly restricting voting rights, and a lot more.
Wow, that's not messing around.
What?
But hold on, didn't Trump try to distance himself from Project 2025 publicly?
He did, yeah. But it's worth noting that a lot of the people involved in creating it are strong Trump supporters, and the ideas it puts forward are very much in line with his stated goals.
So even if he's not officially endorsing it, it's kind of like a sneak peek into what he might prioritize if he gets a second term.
It's certainly possible, yeah. And the Al Jazeera article paints a pretty unsettling picture of what that second term might look like. They talk about an administration focused on settling scores and consolidating power. And they suggest that Trump might fill a lot of key positions with loyalists, people who are more focused on pleasing him than on, actual governing.
Oh, so less about experience and qualifications and more about blind loyalty.
Yeah.
And if we connect that to the idea of the Republican Party becoming this personalist party, it raises some serious questions about whether there would be enough internal dissent, enough pushback to keep those impulses in check.
Exactly. And that's why a lot of people are drawing comparisons between Trump and another strongman leader, Javier Milei, the right-wing president of Argentina.
Argentina. That seems like a bit of a jump. What's the connection there?
Well, Milei is another populist leader who came to power on a wave of anger and dissatisfaction with the status quo, much like Trump.
Okay, so there are some parallels in their rise to power.
Yeah.
But what about their actual governing styles?
That's where things get interesting. Milei has found it very difficult to get things done because he doesn't control the legislature. His agenda keeps getting blocked. And that highlights how even a powerful, popular leader can be constrained by the checks and balances built into the system.
So the takeaway there is that even if Trump wins a second term, it doesn't automatically mean he'll have free rein to do whatever he wants.
Exactly. The makeup of Congress is going to be crucial. If Republicans control both the House and Senate, it could clear the way for Trump to push through his agenda with very little resistance.
But if there's divided control, if the Democrats have a majority in one or both chambers,
then we're likely to see a lot more gridlock, a lot more legislative battles. And that could actually limit Trump's ability to make sweeping changes.
okay, so Congress is definitely a key player here. Now, I want to circle back to that word the article keeps using, authoritarianism.
Yeah.
For those who might not be political junkies like us, what are the signs of a country actually sliding towards authoritarianism? I mean, the U.S. has all these checks and balances in place, right?
Right, in theory. But systems can be manipulated, norms can be eroded, and institutions can be weakened over time. And the article points to some concerning trends that emerged during Trump's first term.
Like what specifically? Give us some examples.
Well, there were his repeated attacks on the judiciary, especially when judges ruled against him.
Oh, yeah, he didn't hold back there.
And then there was the constant undermining of the press, labeling any news he didn't like as fake news.
That was a recurring theme for sure.
And those are classic authoritarian tactics, attacking the free press, trying to undermine the independence of the courts.
Okay, yeah, that's starting to sound a little alarming.
And remember, we can't ignore the lasting impact of January 6th. The attack on the Capitol was a deeply disturbing event, and it raised serious questions about Trump's respect for democratic processes.
You're right. January 6th was a turning point, and it left a lot of people feeling shaken and uncertain about the future of American democracy.
Absolutely. And the article suggests that January 6th might make some traditional Republicans, the old guard, hesitant to serve in a second Trump administration.
Because they don't want to be associated with that kind of chaos and lawlessness.
Exactly. They might see it as too risky, too damaging to their reputations. They might worry about being complicit in something they see as a threat to American democracy.
But on the other hand, there's also a very real fear of crossing Trump, of alienating his base.
Oh, absolutely. The Republican Party has become so Trump-centric that defying him could be political suicide for anyone with ambitions for higher office.
So it's a tough spot for a lot of these Republican politicians, caught between a rock and a hard place.
It really is. And it'll be fascinating to see how this all plays out. If Trump does win a second term, who will he surround himself with? Will there be enough pushback from within his own party to keep him in check?
So many questions. We've covered a lot of ground here, and I think we need to take a moment to process all of this. We left off talking about a potential second term for Trump and how that could impact the U.S. system of government. But the article also hints that the global landscape could look very different too. What are some of the potential international ripple effects we should be thinking about?
Yeah, it's easy to forget when you're focused on U.S. politics that what happens here has consequences far beyond our borders. And, Trump's America First approach during his previous term was a pretty big departure from how the U.S. has traditionally interacted with the rest of the world.
Yeah, those trade wars with China were definitely hard to miss. And there was some tension with European allies, especially over NATO spending. Some people might argue that it's a president's job to prioritize their own country's interests above all else. Is there a line between looking out for America and potentially destabilizing the global order?
It's a tricky balancing act for sure. On one hand, every leader has a responsibility to put their own citizens first. But on the other hand, global stability relies on cooperation and diplomacy. For decades, the U.S. has been a key player in promoting things like democracy, free trade, and human rights around the world. If America steps back from that role, it creates a vacuum that other countries might be eager to fill. And those countries might not have the best intentions.
I'm getting a mental image of a seesaw with the U.S. and, say, China on opposite ends. If the U.S. gets lighter, the other side automatically goes up.
That's a great analogy. We've already seen countries like China and Russia becoming more assertive on the world stage. A more isolationist America could embolden them even further.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there in terms of global implications. But let's shift gears back to domestic politics for a moment. We talked earlier about the article's warnings about authoritarianism. That's a word that gets thrown around a lot these days, but for folks who might not be political science experts, can we break down what that actually means in practice? I mean, the U.S. has all these checks and balances in place, right?
Right, in theory. But systems can be manipulated, norms can be eroded, institutions can be weakened over time, and the article argues that we've already seen some warning signs during Trump's first term.
Like what specifically? Give us some examples.
Well, there were his repeated attacks on the judiciary, especially when judges ruled against him.
Oh yeah, he didn't hold back there.
And then there was the constant undermining of the press, labeling any news he didn't like as fake news.
That was a recurring theme for sure.
And those are classic authoritarian tactics, attacking the free press, trying to undermine the independence of the courts.
Okay, yeah, that's starting to sound a little alarming.
And we can't forget about the lasting impact of January 6th. The attack on the Capitol was a deeply disturbing event, and it raised serious questions about Trump's respect for democratic processes.
You're right. January 6th was a turning point, and it left a lot of people feeling shaken and uncertain about the future of American democracy.
Absolutely. And the article suggests that January 6th might make some traditional Republicans, the old guard, hesitant to serve in a second Trump administration.
Because they don't want to be associated with that kind of chaos and lawlessness.
Exactly. They might see it as too risky, too damaging to their reputations. They might worry about being complicit in something they see as a threat to American democracy.
But on the other hand, there's also a very real fear of crossing Trump, of alienating his base.
Oh, absolutely. The Republican Party has become so Trump-centric that defying him could be political suicide for anyone with ambitions for higher office.
So it's a tough spot for a lot of these Republican politicians, caught between a rock and a hard place.
It really is. And it'll be fascinating to see how this all plays out if Trump does win a second term. Who will he surround himself with? Will there be enough pushback from within his own party to keep him in check? Or will we see a further slide towards authoritarianism? These are the questions that keep me up at night.
Yeah, no kidding. This is heavy stuff. And speaking of heavy stuff, the article also talks about the potential psychological impact of another 4 years of Trump. They suggest it could lead to increased anxiety, division, and even trauma, particularly among marginalized groups.
That's an important point, and it's something that often gets overlooked in these kinds of discussions. Politics isn't just about policies and elections. It's also about how we feel, how we relate to each other, and how we view the world around us.
It's about the overall tone and atmosphere, right?
Yeah.
And the article argues that Trump's rhetoric and behavior have created a climate of fear and division, and that this can have a real impact on people's mental and emotional well-being.
Exactly. We've seen a rise in hate crimes and incidents of discrimination in recent years, and it's hard not to connect that, at least in part, to the increasingly polarized and hostile political climate.
It's like the negativity trickles down and permeates everything. It's not just about who's in office. It's about how we treat each other as human beings.
You're absolutely right, and it's something we all need to be mindful of, regardless of our political affiliations. We need to find ways to have these conversations respectfully, even when we disagree. We need to remember that there's more that unites us than divides us.
Well said. So how do we navigate this? How do we stay informed and engaged without getting sucked into that vortex of negativity and despair? It feels like it's so easy to go down that rabbit hole.
Yeah, it's definitely a challenge. I think it's important to find healthy ways to cope with the stress and anxiety that this kind of political environment can generate. That might involve limiting your exposure to news, connecting with supportive communities, or finding ways to channel your energy into positive action. Things like volunteering, getting involved in local politics, or simply talking to friends and family about your concerns can make a big difference.
It's a good reminder that we're not powerless in this situation. There are things we can do to take care of ourselves and each other, even when the broader political landscape feels overwhelming.
Exactly. And remember, you're not alone in feeling this way. It's a challenging time for a lot of people. Don't hesitate to reach out for support if you need it. There are resources available, whether it's talking to the therapist, joining a support group, or simply confiding in a trusted friend or family member.
That's great advice. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from domestic policy to global relations, from economic consequences to the psychological impact on people. But we focus a lot on the potential downsides of a second Trump term, which is understandable given the concerns raised in the article. But before we wrap up, I want to flip the script a bit. Consider a question the article doesn't really address. What if, and I know this is a big what if, but what if Trump's second term turns out to be surprisingly successful?
No, that's a thought-provoking question. It forces us to think about what success would even look like in this context. Would it mean fulfilling those controversial campaign promises, or would it involve a more nuanced approach? Would it be about achieving specific policy goals, or would it be more about changing the tone and tenor of American politics?
Right. Maybe success means defying expectations. Perhaps Trump pivots from his America First stance and focuses on rebuilding relationships with allies. Or maybe he surprises everyone by prioritizing domestic issues that have broad bipartisan support, like infrastructure or healthcare reform, things that could potentially bring the country together rather than dividing it further.
That would certainly be a departure from his first term, but it's not entirely outside the realm of possibility. Presidents have been known to evolve in office, responding to changing circumstances and shifting political winds.
And let's not forget the power of public opinion. If Trump faces significant pushback on certain policies, he might be forced to moderate his approach. We've seen throughout history how public pressure can influence even the most powerful leaders. Protests, activism, media scrutiny. These can all play a role in shaping a president's agenda. So while the article we discussed paints a rather bleak picture, it's important to remember that the future is not set in stone. There's always the potential for unexpected twists and turns.
Absolutely, and that's what makes politics so fascinating. It's a dynamic process full of surprises and uncertainties. We can analyze the past, we can speculate about the future, but ultimately we don't know for sure what's going to happen.
So let's indulge in a bit of optimistic speculation for a moment. If Trump were to have a successful second term, what might that look like? What kind of positive outcomes could we imagine?
Well, one possibility is that he manages to achieve some significant economic gains. Perhaps he negotiates favorable trade deals, stimulates job growth, or implements policies that benefit certain sectors of the economy. That could certainly boost his popularity and legacy.
And maybe, just maybe, he surprises everyone by finding common ground with Democrats on certain issues. Imagine bipartisan cooperation on things like infrastructure, climate change, or even healthcare reform.
It's a hopeful thought, and who knows, maybe a successful second term could even lead to a more unified and less polarized America. It's a long shot, perhaps, but it's not impossible.
Okay, now I'm really letting my imagination run wild. But hey, it's good to have a little hope, right? Even in the face of uncertainty and potential challenges, it's important to remember that things can change, and sometimes they change for the better.
Absolutely. It's important to remember that even in challenging times, there's always the possibility for positive change.
All right, so as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought. Regardless of your political views, regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump, let's all try to approach this new chapter in American history with a sense of open-mindedness and critical thinking. Let's engage in respectful dialogue, challenge our own biases, and strive to understand different perspectives.
Well said. And most importantly, let's not lose sight of the things that unite us as Americans: our shared values, our commitment to democracy, and our belief in a better future. Those are powerful words to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into a potential second Trump term. It's been a fascinating and thought-provoking conversation.
And until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the conversation going. It's fascinating to think about how different a second term for Trump could be compared to his first. And while we can speculate all day, the truth is we're all just along for the ride at this point.
You're telling me politics is anything but predictable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But that's what makes this deep dive so interesting, right? We're using this Al Jazeera article as a jumping off point, but it's really about exploring the possibilities, the what ifs, and how those different scenarios could play out.
I think that's key, especially when we're dealing with a figure as polarizing as Donald Trump. There are very strong opinions about him on both sides, and it's easy to get stuck in those echo chambers.
I know I'm guilty of that sometimes. It's good to be reminded to step back, look at the bigger picture, and consider those alternative viewpoints.
It's something I have to remind myself of, too. Especially in my line of work, you can get so deep into the data and the analysis that you lose sight of the human element.
Which is why I appreciate having you here to help us make sense of all this. You're able to connect those dots in a way that's both insightful and engaging.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. And I have to say, I enjoy our conversations as well. You always bring a fresh perspective, and a healthy dose of skepticism.
Well, skepticism is kind of my superpower, I guess.
Right.
But seriously, I think it's important to question everything, especially when it comes to politics. There's so much spin and misinformation out there, it's easy to get lost in the noise.
That's where critical thinking comes in. It's about being able to evaluate information objectively, identify biases, and form your own informed opinions.
Which is what we're all about here at the Deep Dive, right? Giving our listeners the tools they need to navigate this complex world.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, as they say.
Well,
And the more informed we are, the better equipped we are to make decisions that benefit ourselves and our communities.
so as we wrap up this deep dive into a potential second Trump term, I want to leave our listeners with a few key takeaways.
Sounds good to me. What are you thinking?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to remember that the future is not predetermined. There are so many factors at play, both domestically and internationally, that it's impossible to say with certainty what will happen.
Agreed. And that uncertainty can be both exciting and daunting depending on your perspective. But one thing we can say for sure is that the decisions made by the U.S. government, especially the president, have far-reaching consequences.
Exactly. We've seen that play out in Trump's first term, and it's likely to be even more amplified in his second term.
So it's crucial that we as citizens stay informed, engaged, and involved.
Absolutely. Our democracy depends on it. And regardless of your political views, regardless of how you feel about Donald Trump, let's all strive to have those conversations with respect, empathy, and a willingness to listen to different perspectives.
Well said. It's easy to get caught up in the us versus them mentality, but at the end of the day, we're all in this together.
And that's a powerful message to end on, I think. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll be back next week with another fascinating topic. Until then, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.